ndion podcast presented by the German Design Council. Our host, Martin Pauli, talks with experts about the major transformation fields in architecture: circularity, new materials and technologies, automation and digitalization, and business models. Martin is the Global Circular Economy Services Leader at international consultancy Arab, and in this role develops strategies for circular design and business model innovations. He is also a member of the Innovation Advisory Board of the German Sustainable Building Council.
Welcome to a new ndion podcast episode of the German Design Council that will explore and discuss the current and future role of architects and their practice and its potential impact to tackle some of the most pressing global challenges. The German Design Council has initiated this format to influence, to inspire, and to make the impact of designers and architects in this context more visible. Today, we expand our geographic focus to one of the most renowned global architecture practices based in Norway that have designed masterpieces such as the Opera House in Norway, Europe's first underwater restaurant, or the Nordic embassies in Berlin. With me today is Jette Hopp, who is a director and a member of the executive management at Snøhetta. Welcome, Jette.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Jette, let's start easy into the conversation. What does Snøhetta stand for?
Yeah, I think not many of you might know that we have for over 30 years borrowed our name from the mountain Snøhetta, the second highest mountain in Norway, because the highest mountain is too hard to pronounce. So Snøhetta, we say it's the place that nobody is from, but anyone can go to. And this is also a good reference to understand our collaborative approach. It started with a workshop between architects and landscape architects to understand the architecture as a built environment, but also as a kind of the framework for human interaction. So we have stayed true to this kind of conception ever since. So the collaboration between landscape architecture and architecture is very much in the core within our interdisciplinary approach, but the number of disciplines has also grown throughout the years, expanding to interior, product design, graphic design, and arts.
Interesting. So I think that seems to become also a red line throughout the entire podcast series, that connection between the architecture practices and the integration with other domains and sectors. And it also seems to be an inherent part of Snøhetta. So I guess you've been there, obviously, also physically.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Because every second year we gather all our colleagues from all over the world. We maybe speak about that later, about the growth of the practice, to share this kind of physical experience, to walk on the mountain Snøhetta, but also then together discuss future strategies. We call it the Dovre conversations, because Dovre is the area of Snøhetta. And we always start in a project of ours, the Reindeer Observation Pavilion, that gives you an outlook of the Snøhetta mountain. We gather there and then we start the climbing tour together.
That sounds very inspiring. When you look back a bit, why did you choose to become an architect?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Actually, I was forced to reflect upon that because I was invited for the architecture talk last week, actually, in Berlin. So I had to reflect a little bit upon, because I don't think it was a very conscious choice. I wanted to become an artist. And then I discussed with my parents, as maybe a lot of children do, well, I want to become an artist. And when my father said, well, okay, but you have to be able to earn your own income. And then they, okay, maybe I find something related. So I have studied architecture in art academies. So I started then with architecture, but always having courses within art and also philosophy, social science. So always having an interest to see architecture as a cultural discipline. And I think that you can also see throughout at least my work and also the context that I'm working in, having the true belief that architecture is the most important expression, cultural expression, also kind of part of the critical thinking, to developed society and having a huge responsibility in designing kind of the built environment.
That's interesting because as you're also referring to the society and to the environment and the context in which the built environment happens, if you like, or is being developed, that is an interesting segue into the discussion, because if we look at the architecture, engineering and construction sector at the moment, it seems to be pretty much at the heart of achieving climate goals, achieving biodiversity goals, and a just transition. And at the same time, it's facing a comprehensive transformation. There's global pressure on climate change and adaptation. Resources are getting scarce. Labor shortage. So there's an emerging tension, obviously, between potentially traditional and future contexts in the way we design, construct, operate buildings. Can you feel that tension in your day-to-day work, and might there be also differences geographically?
Certainly we can feel the tension, but I think it's important to remind ourselves what is the core of our disciplines. We are designing spaces for people. So I think this remained unchanged, and also what I referred to earlier, our responsibility. We have a responsibility towards also society, especially in the role of Snøhetta, where we also often are commissioned with the public buildings. So what is the added value? How can we kind of, design for people, increase kind of accessibility, inclusivity, justice? So I think this, for me at least, has remained unchanged. And I might also refer back to Snøhetta because we were founded in parallel 1970. That's quite a while ago, over 30 years. But interestingly, at the same time, the report for the UN was launched, Our Common Future. And that was actually the first time where sustainability was kind of put on the political agenda, because sustainable development means that, of course, a generation can develop, but not compromising the future of the next generation. So this kind of commitment, the social sustainability, which we still see as the foundation of our work, this is kind of remains and has to be present, I think. And of course, with the increasing climate change and challenges and crisis, the ecological and also financial sustainability has become very central in our work. And that also leads to a field of complexity where we have to expand competence, collaborations. It's not only about the architects kind of chairing the field. It's about really this, from the very beginning, collaborative approach. That is very much embedded in our DNA, because we always, from the beginning, said we need several disciplines. But now it's over the at least 15 years, it has expanded into, engineers, specialists, climate specialists, all the disciplines that you need from the very beginning to tackle the complexity of the tasks and the topics that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's interesting, because also the complexity is something that reoccurs. Often there are trade-offs, there are different targets that you want to achieve, but what I get is already that obviously there is a very clear DNA and a foundation. Do you have a specific project example that you want to share with us, where you believe that the approach that you have found met particularly well the targets, and where you somehow could also solve those trade-offs that will always occur in every project, I guess?
Yeah, I think a good example is the Powerhouse collaboration that Snøhetta was part of founding 15 years ago. And that was also to face the fact that the energy sector and building industry accounts for over 40% of global industry's heat-tapping emissions combined, according to the World Resource Institute. So we found, okay, how can we deal with what can our contribution be? So we founded the Powerhouse Alliance, which is alliance within partners in the Norwegian building industry, where Snøhetta is the architect and landscape architect. But we also have engineers, an engineering company. We have a contractor. We also have research institutes, University Zero, the SAP Institute contributing. And the aim is to change the standard of the building industry. Mm-hmm. So the Powerhouse, the collaboration aims to set a new standard for construction of the buildings of tomorrow. And that is one that produces more energy than it consumes over its lifespan, including construction, demolition, and embodied energy of materials. This also includes the embodied energy in the material used to construct the building. And as of today, Snøhetta has been involved in 6 Powerhouse projects. And one of them, for example, is the Powerhouse Brattørkaia, which is the northernmost energy-positive building in the world. So we have another one, which is the Powerhouse Kjørbo, which is the first building in the reconstruction or the refurbishment category, an office building. Yeah. So we have several, and we also have others in the pipeline. But I think here it shows very well that one has to expand the disciplines and also kind of find alliances that we can secure the full chain, also the construction part. That's why Skanska and this alliance is on board. So this, I think, is a good example how one can think out of the box and holistically, and also challenge building and construction rules, and also go into active negotiations with the legal part, because sometimes we see when we design and have construct energy positive building, we also have to challenge the legal framework of the specific building plot, because we also say that for the Powerhouse, at least, the definition entails that we have to produce renewable energy on site. It's not that you can buy renewable energy from a solar park. Everything has to happen on site. Yeah. So that means we might sometimes have to build higher because we have a specific angle for the roof in order to harvest sufficient solar energy, for example. So we have to actively negotiate with municipalities and other stakeholders for this project, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's absolutely interesting because, again, it talks to the complexity about technological aspects, social aspects, legal aspects, environmental aspects, and bringing all that together into one coherent piece is, I guess, always the challenge. What I find interesting is you mentioned the holistic perspective that you're looking. So you're not just looking at a net positive operation of the building, but a net positive whole life carbon perspective, including upfront embodied carbon of materials. Because I think this is exactly also for me personally what we need to get right as soon as possible in the future, because we kind of mentioned that also, or you hear that often in conferences, that you can design the most operationally green building, but after the first hour of operation, it might have released 70% of carbon emissions already to the atmosphere. And I think this somehow defines the playing field for architects, plus the supply chain. It's interesting that you mentioned the likes of Skanska. So to really think holistically along the entire chain. Now that sounded like it's very successfully working in Norway or in Scandinavia already. You are a global practice. Can you maybe reflect a bit whether we have different maturities in other parts of the world, or where you see positive signs?
Yeah, we obviously have, and it's interesting that you start the question because these projects have been realized in Norway. And of course, we are a small society, only 5 million people, and also a rich society, and also we have a responsibility, I think, since a lot of our wealth is founded on oil. We have a responsibility also to develop us out of this kind of dependency. So I think there's also a very strong motivation to have these pilots and showcases, not only pilots, but also kind of, because it's also about sharing competences and knowledge. So it's not only, it's really about, that's why economic sustainability is also important, because those buildings have to be kind of constructed within a market realistic scenario. Yeah. And the other part of your question was the global footprint, so to say. I mean, Snøhetta started, we were about 20 years ago, we were about 50 colleagues with only one office in Oslo, but acting globally. But then over the last 30 years, we are now 9 studios around the world with more than around 380, 400 colleagues. Yeah, just to mention. I mean, it started in Oslo. Then we opened our studio in New York as part of the 9/11 Pavilion Memorial Site development, Times Square, and that has led to, of course, more projects than San Francisco. And then we opened offices in Innsbruck, Paris, Hong Kong, Adelaide, Melbourne, and the last in Shenzhen. And of course, as a global architectural practice, there was also a reasoning behind that. It was not about a global expansion. It was always projects first. But then we saw that we had to contextualize more and more. And that's why the opening of the respective studios came always after. And especially due to the need of contextualize our activities. And when it comes to the sustainable part, of course, the level of what you can achieve in terms of sustainability differs where you are in the world.
Yeah.
And that has to do with the matureness, of course, of the industry and what kind of impact you can have. But I think you have to adapt. I mean, sometimes a small social sustainability part in a project can mean a lot for a society. When, for example, when you work in cultures that are very different from the cultural framework of Europe, for example, then suddenly, due to a conception of the building, men and women can walk through the same entrance, which for us is nothing we would think about. In other societies, this is a major step. And also that you have the same number of toilets in the building for men and women. And then consequently, how this is a cultural center in Saudi Arabia. Of course, you can criticize us working in these contexts, but we think that we want to be an active contributor to also social development and how kind of the built environment can also contribute to the development and the betterment of societies. This is just a small example. But of course, in other contexts, for the first time, embodied energy of materials can be set on the agenda, which was not a topic, for example, in parts of the world when it comes to the execution of buildings. So there you can, in some project there are smaller steps, but which are larger impacts for other projects that are following. So it's sometimes just set a topic on the agenda, and we have, since we have the reputation, it also follows a responsibility, and we see that there's a diversity, what we can achieve, obviously, but it has to be kind of contextualized depending on the project that we are working on. In other parts of Europe, for example, the timber construction, we can make an impact. So different topics that we are able to realize in different contexts.
Yeah. And what I get from this is that the maturity of the context in different geographies seems to vary, of course.
Yeah,
Some policy environments might be more advanced than others, might be more focused towards, resource productiveness or environmental sustainability. Still, and you mentioned that, the responsibility that you as an architect and as an architecture practice have to also raise the bar and raise the ambition level. I think this is something that I find interesting and inspiring, because with that you can almost create a demand, and then the supply side, for instance, the industry, even policymaker might follow because they see those emerging lighthouse projects. And that is also pretty much a red line throughout all podcasts. There is an increasing need for lighthouse projects, for projects that kind of clearly articulate and provide the evidence that, super whole life carbon targets or net positive designs are actually working. Because the industry is still very risk averse, very slow, and is looking for these kind of real world examples. In terms of kind of further challenges and how the architecture practice might evolve, what do you think are upcoming challenges that you and Snøhetta as a practice have to respond to in the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah, that's also an interesting question. But I just wanted to follow up because I think that for me it's a very important topic, what you mentioned about the lighthouses, because we need to build examples to build kind of confidence and trust that this is actually the right direction to go. And we also have to monitor these buildings because that's what we are also doing with the powerhouses. They are actually operating better than planned. I think that's also an important part, that also the economic upside of those buildings, especially when the increased energy prices, that those buildings can operate themselves and even have a surplus that they can sell the energy to the net, which also is a negotiation part of this project. It's not something that works necessarily so easy. But still, I think that's an important part also when we want to export the model also to other parts of the world, as we are actually now starting to do, like the Czech Republic. Also, we will have some meetings in Germany. But then it's so helpful to have these buildings already constructed with a track record, so there is a kind of confidence, okay, this is something achievable also for a decent construction price, because that's also important.
Yeah.
When it comes to the next scenario, I mean, what I, of course, see and what is kind of also embedded in these project where we have the expanded collaboration teams and scenario, I think that is a direction that our role will also be something of a, not necessarily of a mediator, but I see the architect's role also kind of part of larger teams, because also being able to deal with the increasing complexity, not only within the construction industry, but also in terms of the societies, the political system that are changing. Also being an advocate for the, I think this has to be re-evoked constantly, the importance of the architect's role also in the society. I think we see also tendency that this has been reduced as a sometimes pure service provider. It's not necessarily that we are so affected, rather since we have this kind of quite a firm standing within the field, but I hear that from colleagues all over the world. So I think also we are part of the critical thinking, also driving societies forward, and the built environment plays an important role also when it comes to stabilized democracies, because it's about how the built environment also reflects on the political system, whether there's inclusivity independent from the social status, income, mobility, age, so the justice and accessibility and equality. I think that's an important part to have a firm stand, a firm position towards. But of course, there are other aspects that we have to deal with, and that's, I think, the importance of having landscape architecture included in all development. And we see that more and more. I mean, for us, this has always been a very natural point of departure for all our development, that we put landscape in the center of our projects. But we see also in terms of resilience, and we see that how to deal with stormwater. There is also now a proof that you have to have, a clear understanding of how to deal with landscape and in urban context, because there are so many challenges also that can be. Conscious landscape design also can be clear response to that. But also we see, for example, in a big urban development that we have in Milan at the moment, a transformation of a former slaughterhouse area that is set to be the first carbon neutral district in Milan. This is, of course, a project that we have been working with for quite some years and will take a while. It's about 200,000 square meter of new construction, all typologies, everything that you can imagine belongs to a new neighborhood, but also about the preservation of existing structures with the saving of CO2, embodied energy in the huge concrete construction that are already there, being a former slaughterhouse, kind of the conversion of those, we will say 4,000 cubic meter of concrete, just giving them a new life, but also letting the landscape being the main driver of the design, because we developed this during COVID, and our Italian collaborators, they were all locked down literally in their apartments, no access to public space, the importance of public realm also in urban developments. We see there's also now a better understanding due to the health crisis actually, the importance of having accessible public space with green, with qualities for the neighborhoods, not only in central location but also more on a neighborhood level. So this has been an important driver for the design for us, a very intuitive and natural way of developing. But also we see there's a change of perception from the collaborator side, which is interesting, due to a health crisis. So with a direct impact on urban development.
Yeah. So there were many super interesting aspects. Actually, the first one was the kind of the role of the architect as an integrator. I mean, you mentioned that in the past, the role might have been or might have somehow decreased. Buildings got more complex, more technology. So we had kind of many more specialist disciplines all of a sudden integrated. And the feeling that I get is that the role of the architect and the architecture practice might in the future develop and expand more towards topics like how do we construct it, what type of materials do we use, how do those materials, for instance, age grace. So sometimes it seems to become much closer to how the practice of an architect might have started centuries ago. And I think this is something that I find very inspiring. The second aspect was how do we prepare buildings, make them part of the nature? How do we prepare them for climate change, make them more adaptable and resilient? I think that was an angle. And then obviously how to deal with existing structures, especially in the European context where you're not kind of or hardly developing new buildings on a green field anymore. So I think, can we maybe start with that integration role? Is that something that you see that, let's stick with the materials, for instance. Is that something that is becoming more important to look at low embodied carbon materials, circular materials? What do we do throughout the operation at the end of life? Or is it just happening in my bubble?
No. That has become an important design driver for all our designs. I mean, as you also had a focus on the complexity of the practice and also the profession has increased. It's not only about design, it's about taste or whatever you had as criteria for your building, but it's the embodied energy, the embodied carbon in a building is something that we monitor from the very beginning. And that also led to that then you need as an architect also a wider field of competence. Yeah. Of course, some of it, and we were very early with the kind of digital development and having the tools available for also kind of programming and monitoring our designs during the design. But also we have expanded our team internally with the climate design specialists, really only working within that field and being a contributor to all our designs. So we have that on the agenda from the very beginning. And also we develop specific sustainability workshop methods and methodology with which we start every project. Yeah. So we identify through a field of criteria what will we especially focus on this particular project. And the embodied energy is always part of it, but for some of them can it be, for example, more the reuse of existing structures and maybe have a different take on the programming of a building. Just look first at what we have and then program accordingly, not program first and then maybe tear down what you have in order to adapt to the program. So I think it's also a shift of mindset that we see. We have to kind of deviate a little bit from always designing a new building, just to have more a thorough analysis of what already there. Sometimes we say we keep everything.
Yeah.
We have that as a slogan for some of our, well, especially the urban designs. We keep everything. We see what can these existing structures cater for, and then we tailor the program accordingly. So I think that's an important change of
that's fantastic
thinking,
so
because it puts what we have in the center. I mean, we have a lot of initiative, European Bauhaus. I mean, there's a lot of focus, especially in Europe, on reuse and giving a second life to buildings, which I also think are the most interesting projects at the moment, also in our portfolio and in our European portfolio especially.
So then build nothing is like the new paradigm, obviously, and dealing with the existing infrastructure and built environment. That makes a lot of sense. And do you think that mindset shift is also happening on the clients, on the developer, the investor, the policymaker side?
Yeah, I mean, we see that we also have an educational role. Of course, we have often clients coming in because they are inspired by the powerhouse that has, at least in Norway, turned into a very strong brand. Also when it comes to promoting new developments. But I think also there are different drivers, let's say, on the client side. Of course, they need good advisors. So I think also an architect with the increased competence that we have can be a good advisor for a client and the specific developments they have in the pipeline. That's one part. But I also think that external kind of, well, let's see, the financial, economic framework like taxonomy also forces the clients to think in a more sustainable manner in order to get funding for the project. So I think there are also external initiative which kind of makes us, sometimes forces developers and clients to think in that direction in order to get the finance side in place for the project. But we see also there's an increased responsibility, and maybe we are lucky that we work with a segment of clients who have a higher consciousness because they're also interested in the social sustainable part that Snøhetta specifically has a focus on, being a contributor to a better life, to a better neighborhood, to have that added value, not only thinking as building as a, part of the construction industry, but also thinking that as a contribution to urban culture and what that means for a new development.
It's interesting, I think the green finance mechanisms that you mentioned, like the EU taxonomy, we also see that they have unlocked quite a significant change, at least in Europe, and that actually it's the entire value chain that is now adopting those technical criteria, and this is then step by step translating into reality. I also find that very promising. I know that you're also teaching and also lecturing, so you have also connections to universities. Do you think that kind of these new paradigms, like working with the existing and focusing on whole life carbon and also having the tools, that this has also landed at the academic level and is being adopted in the way students are educated at the moment?
There is a great interest by the new generation of architects that are now being educated. It's a quite responsible, very careful new generation of architects growing up. I think the universities still have to catch up. I think it's not from the very beginning part of the agenda that we have an increased complexity within the discipline of architecture. Certainly we have to remind ourselves and be educated in the core. I mean, it's about the spatial thinking that still, of course, remains. That's where the point of departure. But I think to have that early on the agenda and also equip the students with the necessary competence and tools very early to make that as an integral part of the design development, I think there is still a way to go. Some universities have that on the top of their agenda, but several, and I see that since I'm, as you mentioned, lecturing quite a bit around, especially in Europe, still I think need to catch up. It's very much dependent on different departments and kind of maybe how mature they are, how agile they are, because that also needs a shift. Again, the change of mindset also has to happen in the universities, I think.
Yes, yeah, that's interesting.
The same agility, I think, and readaptation of also the educational programs.
Sometimes, my feeling is that the universities seem to somehow feel a bit a tension between keeping the university as a space where you can kind of develop your thinking and your attitude towards architecture and the built environment without too many constraints. And sometimes that can be a conscious decision. But then obviously we know that the reality might look entirely different. And in that sense, the way students are prepared for that new reality, which I believe we have quite a clear view on, something that is going to be increasingly relevant. The second aspect that you mentioned in one of your earlier statements was landscape and the way architecture is kind of weaved into nature and the other way around. I don't necessarily think you meant that literally in terms of, if we take the opera house, where the landscape aspect seems to be quite visible, but I guess that was not necessarily the landscape you were referring to. Are there examples or specific projects where you believe that there was a particularly interesting integration between architecture and nature, and what were the drivers to make that happen?
Yeah, since you mentioned the opera, maybe that's a good example for the more kind of high-level understanding of why architecture and landscape architecture are related, because there it was more to perceive a cultural typology as a public realm in terms of accessibility and to be able to establish a kind of public ownership. I think that was our main kind of motivation, to turn a cultural monument into a social monument. That was our kind of translation of the briefing of that project at that time. And maybe to better cultural understanding from the Nordic point of view, we have something that is called the right to roam. That's a heritage right from the 1950s that allows everyone to move freely through the landscape, meaning landscape belongs to everyone. So we tried to translate that kind of intuitive, collective into a build typology, so that you also move similar to how you would move in the landscape, and that kind of established this public collective ownership. I think that's more the understanding, that also by interpreting architecture as a built landscape, you also can establish a different relationship to the users and the public, and how it's integrated in the urban and public realm. That's where we come from. But when it comes to landscape as a driver in urban development, as I mentioned earlier, it's also to give priority to the public realm, the biodiversity, the green in the urban context, and not letting the landscape come at the very late or the end of the chain, because sometimes or very often we see the building gets constructed, the budget is used up, and then we have to deal with the rest for the outdoor areas. So also really prioritizing landscape, also when it comes to the construction part, budget, putting value into that kind of, it's also how you experience the city, and the urban landscape is also as related to the quality of the public and outdoor areas. I think that's also something we are quite conscious about. Yeah. And being a strong advocate also to don't lose that perspective and having a more holistic approach.
And it also seems to entail the benefits that nature also provides in terms of the services for kind of habitat for species, or filtering water, or cleaning the air, or reducing the temperature. So I think using the kind of the benefits that nature can bring and integrating that seamlessly into the built environment, that also seems to be, it's not only emerging, this is becoming a big theme, obviously, also in the future. So what can we actually learn from nature? How can we integrate that into buildings? And what can then buildings, the built environment, give back to nature? And not only take and cause ecological losses, but what can they actually give back to create ecological gains. I think this might be something that is occurring. The third block was kind of the increasing focus on the existing. I mean, this is something that, okay, if you're an architect, you tend to appreciate like those iconic buildings and structures that, they never obviously happen in isolation. But I think architects are also kind of somehow trained to look at architecture pieces on green fields or like very iconic things. And what I get from the conversation so far, this is obviously shifting, especially in Europe. It's kind of how to deal with the existing environment and having also the courage to not build. So, you don't need to give a percentage, but what's the rough share, do you believe, in your project pipeline of new versus dealing with existing structures?
Yeah, I don't have exact numbers, but I can just see that there's this increase of those projects, obviously, especially in Europe, because as you said, there are not so many greenfields, there are sometimes brownfields, so it's a conversion of, for example, military areas, but also with existing structures. I mentioned the former slaughterhouse area in Milan, where there is quite a substantial amount of already huge buildings that will be converted. But one of our large project that we have under development currently is in Brussels. It's the conversion of a 1970s building, which is 80,000 square meters. It's a kind of quite an iconic shape of the 1970s, a monofunctional building with no kind of, how can I say, no interest for the public realm. So we are stripping it down. We are increasing public accessibility. We are inviting people up to a public terrace overlooking the city because it's close to the Bourse, to the opera. So it has a very prominent location in the center of Brussels, and we are kind of working with Rotor, which is kind of an agency that's very much renowned for this circularity of building materials. So we are demounting one-to-one materials, putting into a material bank, reusing it in our building, but also then making it accessible for other projects. So I think this is a good example where the preservation, the transformation of an existing building, which has a substantial CO2 footprint. It's huge concrete construction, very monolithic, very heavy building that is giving a second life. So I found that super interesting. And the one in Milan also has a quite substantial component of existing structure. We also see in Norway also cultural building, the transformation. Sometimes it's also with additional building extensions, but the core is then always an existing building. And the first powerhouse that was built was also then the retrofit of an existing office structure of the 1980s. Yeah. Where we kept the concrete structure, meaning we started already from negative carbon calculation because we have already a saving due to the non-construction of the concrete structure.
Yeah. So if you look at maybe 10 to 20 years ahead, Snøhetta, but also the role of architects and the entire practice, what would you wish for? What are your thoughts? How might that practice evolve and further adapt to the changing context?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think when I look how we developed over the 30 years, we kept our commitment to the social sustainability. That's still the core of any operation, of all our operations. I mean, the Nordic values with accessibility, democracy, inclusivity. So having that as the framework of everything we do. So I think with that core, it's more the adaptation to the complexity that we see, and also with the opening of our studios around the world, not being also able to, even though we are a global practice, being more contextual, more local. That is an important part because it's also about then the respect of the local versus the global kind of competence, but versus the local culture, society. So also being able to respect and find a a reasonable and a relevant response accordingly within the built environment. So we need that kind of link. What I also see, but this is not necessarily a change, it's more further development of the collaborative processes that we have always been committed to, and that's how we work. This will expand, and hopefully we will able to inspire even more also in cultures where this is not so kind of natural part of how one drive or conduct business. So being more on the non-hierarchical side, more kind of trust-based, problem solving, not so much of the, So I think this is an important part, the resilience I mentioned, so the importance of landscape, the role of landscape in urban development. So it's not nothing necessarily that would change. It's more strengthening the path that we are already on.
Yeah.
I think we have all the tools. I think we are coming with the right values, at least from how I see it. So being an ambassador with our field for the betterment of society, that has always been our objectives. So kind of fine-tuning, developing more skills, having maybe more expand the team with more specific specialists to tackle the very contextual of any tasks we might meet. So I think it's more maintaining the holistic, but also being then very contextual, what we also are, but even then with even more local competence in any operations we are in.
So then referring to Darwin, it's obviously your ability to adapt over time that makes you strong. And what I also sense is, and I really kind of appreciate that, is that sense of optimism that you look to the future.
Yeah, and never forget the human-centric perspective.
Absolutely.
I think that is designing for people. I think that's the big letters on everything we do. So,
I think that's a super clear North Star. So what I took away, again, also reflecting on that optimism, I mean, your ability, you as an individual, but also kind of collectively of architects and the entire practice, to raise the bar and to lead the way, to show there's evidence that we can achieve certain targets, that is more important than ever before. And it also reflects like the huge responsibility that the entire practice has. I think the way the architecture practice collaborates with other specialist disciplines might become even more important. And you mentioned and you gave examples as to how you also adapted to that in the future and will adapt in the future. And how the built environment, despite obviously the environmental targets and the green finance around and the policy, but the role to unlock social value and a just transition. I think this is something that is always or often forgotten, the local aspect of architecture. And I think that also appreciates that architecture never happens in isolation, that it will always respond to a local need. And I think that was pretty much a summary already. And with that, we are already at the end of this podcast. I would love to continue the conversation. So if you have comments or feedback related to this podcast, feel free to get in touch. You will find the contact details as well as a summary in the show note. So many thanks, Jette, for this fantastic conversation.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure and enjoyed it very much.